When I met Jackson Ray, he had that kind of smile that didn't just charm, it disarmed, disoriented, and left a wake of hearts pretending they were never broken. And even though I should have been smarter, should have seen through the glint in his eye that hinted he was more hunter than partner, I fell hard, like a girl who'd never built anything from nothing, like a woman who hadn't survived boardroom rejections, late nights on ramen, and tech bros telling me I'd never make it without a male co-founder. Because somehow, this man with effortless confidence and tailored blazers made me forget I was once the same girl who pitched in front of VCs with trembling fingers, but a voice that refused to crack. And he swept in right as my name had started appearing in publications that used words like disruptor and rising mogul. So I told myself this must be fate. And when he sent flowers to the office, remembered my assistant's name, and quoted my favorite novelist without checking notes, I let my guard down, not because I didn't have walls, but because he climbed over them in ways so soft, I didn't notice I was surrendering brick by brick. And when he proposed at sunset in Napa, with a ring that sparkled like it belonged on a magazine cover, my first instinct was to protect what I built. So I brought up a prenup, gently, half expecting support from someone who always said he admired how I fought for everything. But his response wasn't shock or hurt. It was mockery, laughter laced with the kind of arrogance that should have been a red flag, but instead became the rope I tied my trust to. And he kissed my forehead and called me paranoid, said, "Baby, if I wanted your money, I wouldn't be marrying you. I'd be scheming from the outside." And I actually believed him. Believed that love didn't need signatures or clauses or protections. So I ripped up the draft I had drawn up in secret, not knowing that moment would be the biggest betrayal, not of him to me, but of me to myself. And time went on, the kind of time that drips like honey when you're infatuated, but eventually curdles when reality catches up. And I kept building, expanding, acquiring, innovating, while he drifted more into the shadows of our business, claiming he was exploring bigger strategic roles that always involved travel, networking, and mysteriously expensive suits that didn't match his actual income. And when he said he'd take over handling some of the investor relations, I thought it was sweet, thoughtful even, until I started noticing things didn't quite align. Random withdrawals, unexplained flight charges, meetings that weren't on the company calendar, and a distance in his eyes, like he was slowly disappearing from the version of us we once promised each other. And I told myself it was just a phase, that success can create gaps, and maybe if I just pulled back, gave him space, he'd come back to the man who used to bring me soup during late-night coding marathons, and watch me sleep with that quiet awe only the truly in love possess. But the space only widened, and soon he was taking calls in the guest bathroom, whispering at 2 a.m., texting in code I wasn't supposed to understand. And my gut, the one that had kept me alive in rooms full of sharks, started screaming. But my heart, always late to the truth, begged for just one more chance to be wrong. And then came the night that finally split the world in two, when I walked in from a red-eye flight and heard his voice carry through the hallway, low but cruelly precise. "Once the divorce is filed, I want it fast, clean. I want the assets frozen so she can't run." And my body froze in the doorway, like every cell decided to stop defending me at once. Like betrayal had come home early and decided to make itself comfortable in the house I paid for. And I stood there, unseen, unheard, watching the man I had once trusted, with everything plot to steal the very ground I stood on. And I didn't barge in, didn't cry or scream or demand explanations, because some women are raised to react and others are forged to observe. And I had learned the hard way that rage is only useful when it's strategic. So I turned and walked away so quietly I could hear my own breath breaking. And when I got to our bedroom, I didn't collapse like I used to when deals fell through or when early investors ghosted. I sat still, opened my laptop, and typed, "How to protect assets before divorce." And the moment I hit enter, I stopped being the woman he thought he married and became the version of me he'd never see coming. And I spent the next few hours spiraling into a rabbit hole of legal structures, offshore accounts, asset protection firms with names like Sovereign Vault and Elite Shield. And every click, every download, every late-night note I took was a stitch in the armor I knew I'd need to wear soon. Because what he didn't know was that I had watched my mother once lose everything to a man who smiled through his lies. And I had promised myself, at 13 years old, while hiding behind a wall, listening to them argue, that no man would ever do to me what my father did to her. And now that promise burned like a brand on my skin. So I didn't sleep that night, not out of sadness, but out of strategy, because the war he declared wasn't emotional for me anymore. It was mathematical, surgical, methodical, and I cataloged every shared account, every asset in both our names, every expense he'd ever made under the guise of business. And I saw the patterns clear as code, the retreats, the gifts, the dinners, the absences, and none of it was just carelessness. It was calculated, designed to bleed me dry before I could see the drain. And I realized then that I had married a man who didn't love me. He loved what I made and the access it gave him and the illusion that he was powerful by proximity. And I knew if I confronted him too soon, he'd gaslight me into silence or escalate into theatrics that would only make me look irrational in court. So I locked up the panic, hid the heartbreak behind spreadsheets, and began building a plan as intricate as the companies I once drew on napkins in dorm rooms. And I whispered to myself over and over, not like a prayer, but like a mission statement. If he wants to play, I'll rewrite the rules. And that night, as the sky turned a color only 4 a.m. understands, I swore I would not just survive what was coming. I would weaponize it, and he would never see me cry. Not in court, not in interviews, not even in his memories. Because by the time he realized what I'd done, I wouldn't just be gone. I'd be untouchable. He didn't speak for the first 10 seconds, which told me more than anything he ever shouted during arguments about leadership or who deserved what. And while his jaw worked like he wanted to say something, all he could do was sit there, blinking at a screen that confirmed he was no longer king of the empire. He believed he built alone because the numbers didn't lie, the balances didn't bluff, and every red zero staring back at him was a mirror of what he'd become, empty, frantic, exposed. And I could feel the shift in the room like an aftershock, subtle but brutal. The way his breathing changed, faster now, ragged like someone choking on his own entitlement. And I waited in perfect silence, not because I didn't have words, but because I knew the silence would slice deeper, sharper, more surgically than any scream. So I let him feel it, the way he used to let me sit in rooms full of executives while he took credit for my ideas and passed me off as just support, the way he called me emotional for raising concerns, but cold for staying quiet. And now, there he was, stunned by the weight of every underestimated second I had stored up and sharpened into a weapon with the help of a woman who didn't flinch when I said, I want out, but I want him to feel it, because Marcella King was ruthless in the way that only women forged in fire could be. And she taught me to use the silence he counted on against him, to hide my planning in the spaces where he assumed I was broken. So while he cursed at the phone and refreshed screens like a glitch would undo the truth, I leaned against the glass windows he once bragged about having views no one else could afford. Now, reflecting a man unraveling and a woman finally standing in her own reflection without needing permission to exist. And I remembered the nights I stayed up pretending to care about his presentations while secretly filing paperwork. The hours spent building shell companies with names like Sonder 8 and Petra Bay that now owned everything he thought was his. From the beachfront home he brought mistresses to the boat he named after his ego, all legally tied to trusts with no strings leading back to him. And when he finally choked out the words, "Where is it?" I didn't answer, because the truth wasn't a location. It was a dismantling, and he was standing in the ruins, too disoriented to realize the disaster wasn't natural. It was engineered, methodically, deliberately, like a symphony written in reverse, with each note erasing his version of history, until all that was left was mine. And even as he stormed into the other room to grab his laptop, frantically typing in passwords, calling banks, barking at no one, I took my time sipping coffee from the mug he once told me to stop using because it clashed with his minimalist aesthetic. And the petty joy of that detail, that small rebellion, tasted almost as good as the freedom humming in my chest. And by the time he came back, paler and more furious, waving his phone at me like it was a weapon, I had already sent the message to Marcella. Phase complete, and she replied within seconds, as if she had been watching, waiting for the moment the beast recognized the cage had closed. And when he demanded to know how I did it, I handed him the glossy white folder I had set aside for this very scene. Its embossed initials, MK, shining under the pendant light like a brand of judgment. And as he opened it, his eyes scanned page after page of filings, timestamps, clauses, and legally binding dissolutions he'd signed under the assumption that I'd always be small enough to overlook. And I watched his face collapse in slow motion as he realized this wasn't just a bad day, it was an execution. And the best part was that every piece of it was clean, legal, signed by his own hand. A man so consumed with appearing powerful that he never noticed the trapdoors I installed beneath his throne. And he kept muttering things like, "You can't do this," and "I'll fix it," as if the law cared about his feelings. And when he tried to threaten me with reputation, I laughed, not because I found it funny, but because the idea that he still thought his name held more weight than my receipts was beyond delusional. It was tragic, and I told him calmly, "You underestimated the cost of using me." And that shut him up just long enough for me to grab my phone, open the voice recording app, and play back the clip I saved from 6 months ago. His voice calling the VP of marketing a useless cow, mocking a junior staffer's weight, bragging about how she'll never leave, she's nothing without me. And as his own words filled the room, I watched something inside him wilt, because now he knew I hadn't just taken his money, I'd taken his mask too. And the man who built an entire image around being untouchable was now bare and stammering in his designer sweats, trying to negotiate with a woman who used to beg for respect. And when he asked, "What do you want?" I looked at him for a long moment, not out of indecision, but because I wanted the weight of the pause to burn. And then I answered with precision, "I don't want anything. That's the point. There's nothing left for you to give." And I walked toward the door, every step echoing with the sound of self-worth returning. Past the framed photo he once staged for Forbes, past the bookshelves lined with titles he never read, past the security system he insisted on installing, but never realized he should have feared me more than strangers. And when I turned the handle, he said, "Softer now," like a man realizing the storm wasn't passing. It was permanent. "We had good times, right?" And I paused only long enough to say, "That's your version. Mine ended the first time you made me feel small for dreaming too loud." And I stepped out into the hallway, leaving behind the wreckage of a man who thought love was control and that loyalty meant silence. And I took the private elevator down to the car Marcella had sent, the one with blackout windows and a folder on the seat marked Phase 2, Reputation. And I didn't cry, not because I wasn't hurt, but because I had already mourned the woman he destroyed. And now I was too busy building the one he couldn't touch. And as the car pulled into traffic, I got the first call from a mutual friend, one of those slick-talking industry guys who used to flirt with me when my husband wasn't looking. And he said, "Hey, I just heard what happened, if you need anything." But I hung up before he could finish, because I didn't need sympathy. I needed silence, space, and time to grow into the force I had always been before he told me I was too much, too loud, too emotional. And the truth was, I had always known how this would end. From the first time he smirked through an apology, from the first time he said, "Don't take it personally." And now he was living the consequence of every dismissed warning, every overlooked strength. And by the time I arrived at my new apartment, bare, sun-drenched, and mine, I felt not relief, but readiness, because this was just the beginning, and he hadn't even begun to feel the full weight of losing the woman who once made him look whole. The courthouse air wrapped around me like a bitter fog, the kind that seeps into your bones no matter how well you prepare. And as I stepped through the doors, clutching my coat a little tighter, I reminded myself that this was not a place for comfort. It was a place for conclusion, for exhaling years of control, deception, and entitlement in one long, deliberate breath. And while the marble floors gleamed like ice, and every hallway hummed with echoes of cases being decided behind heavy doors, I spotted him immediately, Jackson Ray, walking in like the marble was polished just for him, flanked by lawyers so sharply dressed they looked like weapons with wrists, all clean lines and controlled smiles. The kind of people who thought justice was about who had the better vocabulary for lying. And when he saw me, he didn't flinch, didn't falter, just offered that same little wave he used to give me at parties, right before he said something to undermine me in public. And I let him have his moment, that final parade of ego, because what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that my war had already been won before I ever stepped into the courtroom. Because Marcella King wasn't just a lawyer, she was a tactician, a storm in a suit. And she didn't need to show up today, because the structure we built together was already holding, already wrapped tight around every dollar, deed, and decision he once believed he had a claim to. And when he leaned in and whispered, "Didn't expect to see you without your usual entourage," I leaned back and said nothing. Not because I was intimidated, but because silence is what you give to men who confuse confidence with cruelty. And when the judge entered, firm-eyed and unbothered, the room shifted, not for me, but for him, because I could feel the energy change the moment she started reading the asset disclosures aloud. And I watched the expressions of his legal team go from smug certainty to hesitant confusion as their entire strategy unraveled with a few simple lines. Your wife's holdings appear to have been legally transferred prior to the separation date. And that sentence alone felt like a thunderclap behind my ribs. Not because it surprised me, but because it meant the plan had executed flawlessly. Every shell company, every offshore trust, every LLC filed under names of women who knew how to go unseen. And the beauty of it was in its simplicity, because while he was preparing to burn me down with financial warfare, I had already moved the battlefield. And when his lawyer finally stammered, "To where?" the judge didn't blink, just replied coolly, "Multiple female-owned entities. All properly documented, all compliant. She owes you nothing." And I could actually see the moment Jackson's bravado cracked, the moment his jaw tightened and his eyes darted to mine like he was seeing me for the first time, not as the quiet partner in the shadows, but as the architect of his ruin. And when he hissed, "You planned this," I smiled and leaned just close enough for him to hear the truth slither from my lips. "You taught me to." And he recoiled like the truth burned. Because it did. Because it always had. And from that moment forward, the hearing wasn't about my actions. It was about his unraveling. And when he tried to paint me as spiteful, as some vindictive wife who wanted to ruin him for fun, Marcella's file, presented by our junior associate, landed with a satisfying thud on the judge's desk, pages detailing the humiliations he thought no one noticed, the nights he insulted me in front of his peers, the business meetings where he claimed I was too emotional for leadership, the audio clips I'd saved from phone calls where he laid out exactly how he planned to control me, bury me, and twist my exit into his elevation. And when I read aloud his own text, "Get her declared unstable if she fights. We need the money," the room fell into a silence so thick it felt like drowning. And I didn't look at him when I read it. I looked at the judge, directly, unwavering, because I wanted her to see that this was not a woman scorned, but a woman sharpened. And she did see it, because when Jackson's team scrambled to argue for alimony, the judge didn't hesitate, didn't even soften her voice, just stated, "This case reeks of strategic manipulation. Your wife's actions weren't cruel. They were smart." And the finality of her voice was a verdict all its own, more damning than any ruling I could have hoped for, because it labeled him for what he was, not just legally, but morally. And when the gavel finally fell and the words were spoken, no spousal support, no division of transferred assets, no further financial claim, I felt something inside me uncoil, something that had been wrapped tight around my spine for years, something that had learned to brace for the next betrayal, the next dismissal, the next round of empty apologies. And now it unraveled into peace. And I stood, adjusted my coat, and walked past him without a glance, because there was nothing left to see, nothing left to hear. And when I stepped into the hallway, sunlight hit me through the tall windows like some divine highlighter. Not because I believed in signs, but because I'd earned that light. And standing there was Marcella, calm as ever, reading from her tablet, her coat immaculate, her presence a silent reminder that women like us don't need applause to feel victorious. And when she handed me a slim folder and said, "Let him process this while we move forward," I took it with steady hands, and together we walked to the waiting car, unbothered by the murmurs around us, the faint recognition in the eyes of people who now saw me differently, not as the woman beside Jackson Ray, but as the woman who left him bankrupt, and not just in money, but in narrative, in pride, in every illusion he had built about himself, using my silence as scaffolding. And the car ride was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was full of momentum, of energy, repurposed from years of pain into a power that could never again be stolen. And when we reached the address I gave her 3 months ago, the one he never knew about, I stepped out into a block lined with startups and new builds, in fresh paint, a place untouched by his history. And I walked up to a building that bore my name in brushed gold. The letters clean, proud, earned, and inside was my team, a small group of women I had handpicked, not just for their skills, but for their stories, for surviving what they weren't supposed to, for rebuilding in secret, for dreaming in places that told them they were too much. And when I walked in, they didn't clap, they didn't cheer, they just nodded, because they knew what today meant. And as I stepped into my office, glass walls, sleek lines, zero ghosts, I sat at my desk and opened my laptop. The background a photo of a wave crashing against a cliff, unbothered, inevitable, and I pulled up the next phase of expansion. Not because I needed to prove anything, but because this was always the plan. Not just to get away, but to build something so extraordinary that he would feel my absence in places he never thought I touched. And as I worked into the evening, reviewing contracts, signing partnerships, taking calls with women who'd once been silenced and were now ready to amplify, I felt the shift fully settle inside me. Not just the freedom, but the responsibility, because I knew women were watching, listening, learning from this. And that meant I couldn't stop here. I had to grow louder, bolder, bigger than his legacy ever was. And the thought didn't scare me. It thrilled me, because the best revenge was never destruction. It was demonstration. And I was going to show the world what it looked like to rise without apology, to win without cruelty, to be soft and sharp at the same time. And when I finally left the office, heels echoing in the quiet building, I didn't feel exhausted. I felt electric, because I wasn't just walking into a new life. I was walking over the grave of every version of myself he tried to kill. And I knew then that the story wasn't over. It was just getting to the good part. The story wasn't over. It was just getting to the good part. And what came next wasn't loud revenge or fiery confrontation, but the slow, undeniable kind of dominance that makes the world lean in without ever needing to raise your voice. And as I moved through the days that followed the courthouse victory, I found myself no longer thinking about Jackson with anger or even pain, but with the kind of distance you reserve for outdated technology. Something that once held your attention, but now barely registers as relevant. Though apparently that realization hadn't reached him, because while I was building partnerships and expanding my firm's reach across 3 major cities, he was launching a podcast from a basement studio with gray lighting and a self-pitying title, talking about how unfair the system is to successful men. And the few people who still followed him online saw right through it, especially after Forbes published my op-ed titled "The Power of Silent Defense: How Women Protect What They Build," which I had written in one sleepless night, with my heart beating like a drum and my fingers flying across the keyboard, like the truth couldn't wait one more second to be freed. And I didn't name him, not because I couldn't, but because he no longer deserved the ink. And still, everyone knew, because they remembered the way his name used to be plastered over startup headlines and tech expos. And they had seen the shift, the silence, the way his company's board restructured without him, how clients quietly stepped back, how my name began replacing his in-rooms he used to dominate. And the contrast was too sharp to ignore. So they connected the dots themselves, and it became a kind of public reckoning, not because I demanded one, but because he made the mistake of underestimating how many people were watching, silently taking note of how he treated me, how often he interrupted me during panels, how he once joked on a live stream that marrying a business partner is like hiring an intern you can sleep with. And now that same intern was outfunding his former firm's entire operating budget through my new initiative, Phoenix Rising, a grant program designed specifically for women trying to escape financially abusive relationships with nowhere to go and no one to believe them. And suddenly, my inbox was full, not just of praise and invitations, but of stories, hundreds of them. Women writing from small towns and big cities, telling me how they read my piece during lunch breaks or in parking lots, or while sitting on the edge of a bed in a home that didn't feel like theirs anymore. And they said things like, "I didn't know someone like you could go through something like that." And, "You helped me make the call." And I knew then that everything he tried to take from me had been repurposed into something greater than vengeance. It had become legacy. And still, he couldn't leave it alone, because the ego doesn't know how to die quietly. So one night, long after I'd finished a pitch meeting in London and returned to my hotel suite overlooking the Thames, I saw it, an email from Jackson, short and pathetic in its simplicity. "You really hate me that much?" And I stared at it for a long time, not because it stirred anything in me, but because it didn't, because the version of me who would have agonized over how to respond, or whether to respond, or what it said about me if I didn't, she was gone, burned into ash in the fire of everything he thought I would never escape. And I didn't write back, not out of malice, but because I had outgrown the conversation entirely. And I deleted the message like you do with spam, with the click of a button and not a flicker of doubt. And I went to sleep without dreaming of him, which was perhaps the biggest victory of all. But he didn't stop, and a week later, at a charity gala I was hosting for survivors of economic violence, he showed up uninvited, slurring his words, suit wrinkled, tie crooked, hair too slick. In that way, men try to look like they still matter. And he tried to push past the registration table, saying he was a guest of honor, and security had to escort him out, while donors whispered, some gasping, some laughing. And I stood there, frozen for just a moment, watching the man who once controlled my accounts, now stumbling under the weight of his own irrelevance. And one of the younger volunteers leaned over and whispered, "Is that the guy she divorced?" And I smiled, not because it was funny, but because it was poetic, how the man who tried to erase me had now become my footnote. And later, when I stood on stage in front of hundreds of women and allies and survivors and whispered warriors wearing gowns and carrying battle scars invisible to the world, I said a line I hadn't rehearsed, but had lived every day of my life since leaving him. Some men teach you love, some teach you power, and some teach you exactly how to protect both. And the applause was thunderous, not because the words were perfect, but because the truth rang inside them like a bell. And in that moment, I didn't see Jackson anymore. I didn't hear his drunken protests from the hallway. I didn't feel the sting of old wounds. I saw only the faces of women who now believed in their ability to lead, to rise. And after the event, one woman approached me with tears in her eyes and whispered, "My daughter watched your keynote on live stream. She's 17. She thinks you're a superhero." And I hugged her, not as a symbol, but as a sister in survival. And I whispered back, "Tell her she is too." And I meant every word, because this wasn't about branding anymore. It was about building something he couldn't poison, something he could never get near again. And when I looked at the financial breakdown of the night's donations, I saw the numbers matching the name of my old offshore holding account, the one he once mocked for being too cautious. And I thought about how cautious women survive longer, build better, and thrive louder when they're done being stepped on. And now that money, the same money he once wanted to leverage in court, was being funneled into shelters, scholarships, and seed funds for women like me. And each dollar felt like a sentence in a story he would never finish, because this time the plot was mine, the power was mine. And the next chapter, he wouldn't even be mentioned. He wouldn't even be mentioned. And that, more than any headline or courtroom verdict, became the truest symbol of my healing. Because true revenge doesn't scream your enemy's name. It whispers yours in every room they're not allowed into anymore. And as the seasons passed and the noise of it all quieted, I didn't slow down. I evolved. I expanded. I started speaking less at people and more with them, listening to women in places I'd never been, hearing stories that mirrored mine in 100 aching ways. And while Jackson faded from the spotlight with the same arrogance he once entered it with, I became something he never planned for, a name that didn't need to be tied to his to hold weight. And that name, Sutton Ray, began to mean something to people beyond my past. Beyond the pain, it became synonymous with something that couldn't be faked. Quiet resilience, strategic recovery, and the kind of unshakable self-possession that makes people stop mid-sentence when you walk into a room. Not because you demand attention, but because your existence reminds them of what's possible after devastation. And one day, without planning it, I built something bigger than I'd ever imagined. The RAYE Foundation, a digital hub for women who had money but no map, power but no protection, potential but no platform. And we centered it around a single message, burned into my bones by every night I stayed up transferring assets while pretending to be okay. Don't just earn it, learn to protect it. And that line caught fire in a way I didn't expect. It ended up printed on mugs, notebooks, emails, etched into the signatures of financial advisors across the country. And suddenly, I wasn't just a cautionary tale. I was a blueprint, and women from all walks of life started writing in. A single mom in Kansas trying to open her first business, a Black trans woman in Chicago who said her boyfriend drained her savings and told her she was lucky to have him, an intern at a hedge fund who whispered over the phone, "My boss said I'm not allowed to have passwords." And I didn't just respond. I called, I connected them with lawyers. I made sure they had tools, templates, allies, because the best thing about surviving someone like Jackson isn't the moment you watch them fall. It's the way you use your survival to make sure no one else has to crawl through that same hell blind. And for a while, I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that the past had closed quietly behind me. Until one morning, my assistant handed me a phone and said, "It's Jackson's sister?" And I hesitated, not out of fear, but curiosity, because I hadn't heard from that part of his world in years. And when I answered, her voice was so soft, it made me brace myself. Humble, cracked, like someone trying to step carefully across something they once ignored. And all she said was, "I just wanted to say, I didn't know how bad he was, and I'm sorry." And I didn't say something righteous, didn't launch into a speech, didn't weaponize my pain. I just said, "Thank you." Not bitterly, not triumphantly, just humanly, because that's the thing people never understand about revenge. It doesn't always need to destroy. Sometimes it just needs to redirect the fire, to carve out warmth in places that were once ash. And that moment with her reminded me, that you can be righteous and still be kind. You can win and still be soft. And years later, when I stood under the hot stage lights of Stanford University's largest auditorium, giving a keynote titled Wealth, Women, and War Zones, I wasn't thinking of Jackson at all. I was thinking of the girl who emailed me from a bathroom stall in Ohio. The one who said she couldn't remember her bank login because her boyfriend made her delete the app. And the girl in the front row that night, barely 19, probably an undergrad, waited until the applause quieted and the lights dimmed before she walked up to me, her hand slightly shaking, eyes wide, like someone finally meeting the ghost in their favorite legend. And she said, "You're the woman who moved her fortune before the divorce, right?" And I smiled, not because that's the legacy I clung to, but because it's the story that taught people to listen. And I said, "I'm the woman who didn't let someone else write her ending." And the relief on her face, the way she seemed to exhale in a way that told me she'd been holding her breath through her own storm, was more valuable than any dollar I'd ever saved. And in that moment, I understood what all of this had been building toward. Not just my freedom, but a message I was now carrying in every room I walked into. From gala stages to high school assemblies, from press interviews to private DMS, from girls hiding in Wi-Fi corners of abusive homes. And that message was this: silence is not weakness, stillness is not surrender, and tears do not mean defeat. They mean you're still alive, still fighting, still yours, and the kind of love that costs you your voice, your bank account, your friendships, your fire. That's not love, it's a leash. And when someone tries to bury you in the court of manipulation, don't argue with them. Rise above them, strategize around them, build underneath them until your success becomes their silence. And when they finally look up from the wreckage and wonder what happened, you won't be there to explain it, because real power doesn't perform. It doesn't shout. It doesn't beg to be seen. It moves quietly, precisely. And by the time they see it coming, it's already too late, because you're gone, far above, untouchable, written into the legacy of every woman who thinks she's too small to win, too soft to fight, too broke to leave. And the last time I passed by Jackson's old building, now half leased and barely surviving, I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation, because I was never meant to destroy him. I was meant to free myself. And now I had, so thoroughly, so irrevocably, that I didn't just walk away, I soared.